All right, guys, welcome to Accessible Charts and Graphs. This is a little Max Extra. My name is Dax Castro, and in this video, we're going to cover some methodologies to help you get your charts and graphs in line, make them accessible, and help you make some decisions about how to create the best combinations without getting too overwhelmed with crazy chart fills and gradients and line styles, and we're going to cover all that. So let's get to it. All right, so differentiators. Differentiators are those things that let us separate one thing from another. And the WCAG Success Criteria 1.4.1 is the use of color. And it says color is not used as the only means of conveying information, indicating an action, prompting a response, or distinguishing a visual element. And this is a level A requirement. So it's a very basic requirement. And we really care most about distinguishing a visual element. So the idea here is that we can't just use color. We can't rely on the idea that someone is going to be able to perceive color in the same way as we do. So what are those factors? Well, we can use patterns, we can use labels, we can use strokes, and we can use shape to differentiate our data when we're creating accessible charts and graphs. So in this example here, you can see we've got some pattern fills inside this pie chart, which can be really confusing when your data gets really complex. With just a few things, it's not too bad. But really adding labels is probably one of the better ways to be able to skirt around having to add a bunch of complicated fills. But then again, it really just depends on the style in which you're using. And then of course you can use line strokes to be able to differentiate information. And we're going to talk about when you can use those or when you should use those, and go through a lot of the different options that you have. So remember, all of these things are guidelines. They're really just here to help you understand kind of what your options are. As you do more and more, as you create more and more accessible graphics, you're going to start having, being able to pull from your bag of tricks and say, okay, in this one, I'm going to use patterns and fills. In this one, I'm going to use labels and maybe shape, right? So let's dive in and take a look at what we're doing here. So the first thing we're going to look at is labels. And here you can see we have a map, and this is a transit map. I want to show you something though before we start. Colorblind compliance, colorblind compatibility is really one of the things that I tend to focus on quite a bit. I know quite a few people that are colorblind, and we tend to use reds and greens and oranges and browns in our legends to differentiate one item from another. But I don't know if you knew this or not, Illustrator actually has a colorblind simulator in it. So if I go up to View and I go to Proof Setup, I can select Deuteranopia or Protanopia. Now Deuteranopia is probably the most prevalent color blindness. It is that red-green color blindness. So we're going to go ahead and turn that on. Now you can see, if we look at our chart, our map here, I don't know about you, but I'm not sure I can tell which one is the green line, which one is the brown line, and which one is the red line. Definitely the gold and the purple kind of stand out a little bit, but this would be very confusing. If this is the way I perceive color, how am I going to know which line I'm supposed to take or which line goes where? Right? If somebody told me, hey, take the green line, which one's the green line? Because I'm not able to tell, right? So how do we fix that? So let's go ahead and go back to our view and turn off proof colors. Now we're back into typical view. We're going to open up our layers here. Now, one of the easiest ways for this graphic that we can add some differentiation is by adding some labels. And simply, we didn't change the map a whole lot, right? We simply added a new numbering system, 1 through 5, that with the addition of these labels, we've made this map much clearer. Now, the one thing we do have to handle is color contrast, right? Because the WCAG says that non-text color contrast should be 3:1 for important elements, right? So that means that if you have meaningful graphics in your diagram, your infographic, it should have a 3:1 color contrast to the items around it, right? So if we look at this right here, and we can see, let's open up the color contrast analyzer here. And you can find this, if you just Google color contrast analyzer, it is a great tool, and it is a free download. I did mention it in my Max session, so you can go over and take a look at that. But if we just simply sample this color here, we can see that this color fails color contrast all the way around, right? So this wouldn't be a good use of color. We'd want to change this to something different. Now, what we could do is we could and it happens to be text and graphics, right? So what we could do is if we go into our layers here and we just select all of our labels, right? Actually, we're going to select all of our text, right? There we go, all of our text. And then we're going to simply color it black, right? Now, if we go and we go to view, turn our proof colors back off, this isn't terrible, right? This isn't a bad graphic. It creates a much more friendly user experience. You're able to see all of it, right? And we do know that the gold line is the gold line. There isn't another way to say it. You're not going to be able to, in a lot of instances, be able to tell a city, hey, you can't call it the gold line because it doesn't meet minimum color contrast. All you can do is do your best to try to make it as accessible as possible. So sometimes your choices are limited. You add on what you can to make the graphic as close to accessible as possible. So in this case, we could even go a little bit farther and we could grab that little number there, get in there, and make that color black, right? Now I have made that, go down here to this other one, make that black. Now I've met minimum color contrast for the text inside and the gold around it. It's not a perfect solution, but this is about as close as you could probably get. Of course, we'd want to change the legend as well. You could do that or not do that. It's completely up to you. But again, this is about choices. How can we make this as close to perfectly accessible as possible? All right, so let's go ahead and save that out. And let's go to our next one. Our next one, we've got this line graph here, right? And we're talking about ridership trend. So this is a line graph we see not to it's pretty common, right? So let's go back to our proof colors, and we're going to go back to proof colors. And I don't know about you, but I definitely can't tell which one's the senior and which one's the worker, right? That'd be pretty important information to know. It's going to change how you understand the data, right? So what can we do? So let's keep our proof colors on for just a moment. And the first thing we want to do is we can use, what are our tools? What are the things that are at our disposal? Well, we have symbols, we have stroke, we have labels, and we have values, right? So values are really not going to be beneficial here in the sense of differentiating one line from another, but symbols could definitely be. So if we simply added some symbology to our line graph here, now it's much easier. I can definitely tell which one is the senior line, which one is the worker line, and which one is the youth line, right? And the other thing you want to remember is that if you are showing a data in a chart or graph, it is a cognitive barrier to say, okay, you've got to come up here and figure out what this data point is. The data point is, I don't know, is it 72? Is it 71? Is it 73? So best practices really say that you should actually add values to your data. Does that mean you have to do every single point? It depends on your purpose, right? If I just want to show the trend that in 2017 we were at 73 and now in 2020 we're at 88, that's what I'm trying to show. So I don't necessarily need to differentiate every single data point, label every single thing, right? It's about what is the meaning I'm trying to convey. So now we have symbols and we have values, right? What's another way? Let's say we don't want to use these symbols, right? So let's just say we're going to turn those symbols back off again. We can use strokes. So we know that we can come in here and change this out. And now you can see very easily, you can still see which one is the seniors and which one is the youth. And we don't have these blobby data points clogging up our line. Maybe that's the item you want to do. Remember, this works because we have 3. Imagine you have 10 different lines. So maybe those data point shapes work better. The other thing you could do, let's go back to our strokes here, and let's turn off those strokes and go back to here. Now I could use stroke thickness to be able to differentiate which one is which. So let's turn on view, turn back our proof colors here, and I can go back and I can say senior, and let's make the stroke be 21, right? 21. And then let's make this stroke be there. So now we have, let's sample that, make sure we get our legend to match. And this should actually be like that. So here you can see that was an issue. We want to make sure our legend matches our map. And sometimes when you use pattern fills, those little tiny squares that have patterns in them, there's not enough there's not enough volume to be able to see what the pattern actually is. So make sure you make your legends big enough. And if you're going to enlarge the legend, make sure you enlarge it to scale so that the relative size of the objects remains the same. So here you can see the senior line's really thick, the workers line is really thin, and the youth line is kind of medium, right? So now we've given several different options for being able to go through and differentiate one from the other. So if I go back to my proof colors, view, and then proof colors, I can very clearly differentiate between seniors and workers. It doesn't matter what color it is, right? And that's the whole point behind Success Criteria 1.4.1. You need to be able to think about, what if I couldn't see color? And that's not just as simple as, if I print this out in black and white, and I've heard this a lot, if I just print it out in black and white, that's going to tell me if I can differentiate or not. True, but it doesn't meet the requirement for WCAG. Color contrast is not a differentiator between one color and another. So you can't just make some lighter and some darker and be perfectly compliant. Now, sometimes there is no choice. Sometimes you have those heat maps, or you have density maps that show a color that goes from 100% fill maybe down to 0 or 5% fill, and it's really a gradation of color, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's the way that you have to present the data. So let's see what WCAG 1.4.11 says about non-text color contrast. How is it okay for us to use that heat map that kind of grades from 100% color down to 0% color? Well, there is this caveat in here for graphical objects. Now, graphical objects doesn't mean every single object in your document. Graphical objects are parts of a graphic required to understand the content. It tells you right there in the beginning. It's the part that's meaningful. Not every single element in your graphic has to have a 3-to-1 color contrast ratio from one to the other. But in this instance, it says parts of a graphic required to understand the content, except when a particular presentation of a graphic is essential to the information being conveyed. In other words, if there's no other way, if this is the only way you're able to present this data so that it can be understood, which is maybe a heat map or a sliding scale, then there's no other way. And so you kind of have a caveat there where you can realize that in certain issues, your map will, or your heat map or your gradient will meet this exception for 1.4.11. So let's go back to our line graph. So right here, we've got our line graph is pretty good. I think we're all set, right? So let's go ahead and save that out. And now let's talk about a bar chart. Now this is a bar chart that not unlike other bar charts that you might have seen, right? And so you can see here that we've got some bars and some ratios, ratings, and some numbers of widgets, and it goes from best to worst. But remember what happens when we turn on proof colors. Let's go back in here and do proof setup, Deuteranopia. Now, I don't know about you, but which one is best and which one is worse, right? If I didn't have the color on there initially for you to see, and this was the first thing you were looking at, the difference between these two is very slight. And honestly, the difference between this one and this one is very slight as well. So you don't know, is red the worst or is red the best? Without more context, we don't know. So let's take a look at this. Now let's go back to view and turn off proof colors for a second. Now we can do what is our first item that we use? Well, it's the one most everybody uses when they first start doing accessibility, which is pattern, right? And you can see from this example, this looks pretty bad, right? This looks atrocious. I'm not sure I would ever put this inside my report unless it was a report on a candy factory, right? Because this looks like a bunch of candy wrappers. So what can we do besides pattern fill? So what if we add some numbering system to our legend? Now, when we turn on proof colors, we can very easily see that this is the worst and this is the best. And we don't care whether it's red or green because we have a value that we know we can identify with, right? So let's go back, turn off proof colors. And then we can also, again, remember, whenever we have values in an axis, either left or right, or left and right, or up and down, we want to try to add those values in the bar chart. We don't want to assume that someone is, because someone might look at this and go, oh, that's like not quite 2, so maybe that's 1. And they're not sure, is it the back line or the front line? So if we add some labels in here, you can very clearly see it looks like they used the back line, right? So this is 2 and 8 and 16. We have some more data, right? We have a way to differentiate and understand the items. We're not, without those labels, we're creating a cognitive barrier. All right. So we have added our data labels. We've added our numbers in our bars. So we don't need to have those crazy pattern fills, right? So that is a great approach to use. The more you can label things, the better off you are. If you just have 2 different things you're trying to compare, maybe pattern fills work. And there are instances where pattern fills is a great option, right? I'm just not a big fan of them all the time. So let's save that out. And let's move on to a pie chart. Now, a pie chart's kind of the same way, but there's a little bit of difference, and we're gonna talk about what that is. So again, we've got these pies, and we know if we go into Proof Colors and turn on Deuteranopia, sure enough, you can't really tell one from the other. This is basically that same bar chart, but just in a pie chart format, right? So what do we want to do? The first thing we want to do is we want to add some labels, right? So now we understand that we've got 100 is down here, but we don't know what size these pies are, right? So we want to add some values. So now we have some values here, and let's turn Proof Colors back off again. So now we can see we've got some color contrast. Remember, text color contrast 3:1. So we want to make sure that if we have to turn these white to make that color contrast meet minimum criteria, then we're going to need to do that, right? Now you could, if you wanted to, bring those out here and have them be off of the pie if you wanted to, but this didn't fit in there, so I made the choice of putting it out there. And you want to try to make things as similar and predictable as possible, because people get accustomed to, that's why we have UX, right? User experience. They want to create a similar or same experience across the board. So in your graphics, if you put things on the outside, then put them on the outside. If you're going to put them on the inside, put them on the inside, but try not to mix them up when at all possible. Sometimes it's unavoidable though, right? So now we have data. The other thing we have to do, remember, is that 3:1 for adjacent items, right? So 3:1 for adjacent items says I need to have a 3:1 color contrast between this orange and this red. But I don't want to change the color, right? I want this color to be the color it is. So if we simply add a white stroke to the outline, now what is the color? Well, the color contrast is between the red and the white, not the red and the orange. The white is the adjacent color. So that saves us from having to have all these crazy contrast ratios inside of our document. All right, so that is a way to handle pie charts, right? Now let's save that out, and let's talk about symbology. So how do we use symbols, right? So if we look at this map happens to be a map of parking stalls or parking availability across a specific city. It's a fictitious map, but they used color, right? So color here, all of the symbols are exactly the same. The only difference from one to the other is color. So let's turn on our proof setup and see what that looks like. Let's go back, proof setup and Deuteranopia, and wow. These two are pretty much dead on exactly the same, right? So how am I going to know whether it's 31 to 40 or 21 to 30? We can use symbology, right? So let's turn on our layers and let's see if we were to turn those off and add, what if we added letters instead of symbols, right? So instead of using a symbol of a car, what if we change it? A, B, C, D, E, right? And now it's much easier. It's definitely easy to know which parking stalls are where. And matter of fact, you notice here, we again had to make sure we adjusted for our color contrast, right? So the other thing we can do is, let's say we don't want letters. They said, look, we don't want to have letters on our map. We want it to stay symbols. What else can you give us, right? Well, the other thing you can do is simply change the shape around the car. So now we've got this diamond, and all I did was take that square and rotate it 90 degrees, and then I stretched it. And then basically for this one, all I did, if we go up here, I'll show you. If I go up here to this one, I added a point in the middle, right there, and I moved it up, right? Big deal. It wasn't a very hard change. And if you're using symbols, the symbols feature inside Illustrator, then all you have to do is edit that parent symbol and it changes all the way across the board. So definitely a good thing to use, right? Now let's go back to view, proof colors, turn them off. And now this map hasn't changed a whole lot, but it definitely has changed enough for you to differentiate between one item and another. Now, the one thing I will say is there enough color contrast between this, the symbol, and the background item? I'm not sure, right? I would have, let's go ahead, and you could make a case that, well, the color contrast between this color, the dark color, and the light color probably is. So maybe you're okay, maybe you're not. This is where testing is so important. And honestly, it's degrees, right? Is this map going to be completely inaccessible without that super 3-to-1 color contrast for every single object? Probably not, but we want to do the best job we can, right? The more planning we have, the better we can make things accessible. And I know a lot of times you get a document at the very end and they said, look, we've designed this document, it's approved by the client, now make it accessible. And you're like, yeah, so this map's got to change because it doesn't meet minimum contrast. They say, oh no, we don't care about that. We just want to deal with the tags tree. And you're like, okay, well, you do the best you can, right? You make small changes to make those documents as compliant as possible. In the end, it really is the best practice. The goal, my hope, is that your agency cares enough about accessibility that they're looking at it at the beginning, or at least in the middle at a draft stage, to be able to start thinking about accessibility so that at the end, it's not this giant lift. I will tell you that planning for accessibility and giving yourself little milestones to check where the progress of accessibility features are in your document will save you hours of time at the end of your document. I promise you. So we've talked about labels, we've talked about line graphs, we've talked about bar charts, we've talked about pie graphs, and we've talked about symbols. But the one thing that we haven't talked about is alt text. Alt text is those descriptors that we have to write for these images, right? So whenever you have a figure, you have to write that alt text. And if you know your accessibility, it's 2 to 3 sentences, 250 characters or so. You want to make sure that you avoid that excessive punctuation, and you want to talk about what is the main takeaway you're trying to give for the user, right? So in this graphic, it really depends. Am I trying to show that where all of these are? In alt text, you're not going to be able to say there is one, parking space with 1 to 10, and there are 4 with 11 to 20, and 3 with 20 to 21. You're not going to go through all of that. So that's where your body text is so supportive in telling the story that you want your figure, your graphic to help support, right? So think about this. And I've got a formula. We're going to walk through some questions that are going to help you decide what you should do when it comes to alt text. So let's go back and take a look at that PowerPoint. So alt text questions to ask. These are the things, this is my methodology for coming up with alt text. And it works pretty well for me. I hope it works well for you. So the first thing you want to remember is that when you get to a graphic, your screen reader is going to announce the word graphic, and it's going to read the alt text. It is by default assumed that your graphic is a photo. So you never want to start your alt text with photo of or image of, right? So we want to know, what is it? So define it without saying, so is it a bar graph? Is it a pie chart? Is it an aerial? Is it a plot map? Is it a heat map? Is it a site map? What is it that they need to understand to give them that base context of trying to paint that mental picture, right? So what is my graphic? In this case, in our description down here, you can see it says pie chart. So we're going to say it is a pie chart. What is my axis? When we've got values, if we look back at our Illustrator file here and we look at our line graph, we can see that this is ridership trends over from 2017 to 2020 on a scale of 0 to 100 riders. So in this case, you'd want to say line graph showing ridership trends from 2017 to 2021. And then from there, you have to decide what is that other meaningful information you want to relate. That there's a general increase in ridership, that we started with, that seniors started at 73 and they ended at 88. If you need to include all the data, if all of it matters, then you really should think about whether or not a table is your better choice or to include it in addition to the line graph. So let's go back to our questions, right? What is important in my legend, right? Only the meaningful stuff. Only keep the meaningful stuff. So if we go back and we look at our pie chart, right? This is customer service. Looks like I got a typo in there. This is customer service ratings per transaction, right? So what's meaningful in this legend? So this is customer service. So this would be pie chart showing customer service ratings per transaction rated from 1 to 5, with 1 being worst and 5 being best. And then you have to figure out how much of this data you want to relate. Hopefully you've done a good enough job storytelling in your body, or you've included a table, or maybe you just care that there were 8 that had less than 100% for a transaction rating, right? It really just depends. You have to make that call. So that's where it becomes important to understand who's going to make that call. If you've got 100 different graphics inside your document, are you the one who needs to write that alt text? This is where getting with your team and getting a workflow together, so you know right away at the beginning of your document, hey, I need someone to write alt text for all of these images or all of these figures, because there maybe someone is an expert on what needs to be said, or they have the approving factor on what needs to be said. And that's super important, right? Alt text is key. Let's go back to our PowerPoint. And then, are there meaningful data points or values? Now, we talked about this, right? And we go back to our Illustrator file here, and you have to figure out what's the meaningful part of this. Is it that 26 to 50 was the largest number of widgets sold was 17? Or is it the fact that we have a 50% difference between the number of worst and the number of almost best, right? It really just depends. You have to figure out what is the meaningful data. Now, in this case, we have 2 different sets of data. We have the rating, and then we have the data value. And maybe if there's just a few data values, you can include those in the alt text because it's short enough. Remember, alt text cannot be paused. Once you start reading alt text in a screen reader, it goes from beginning to end. And if they miss a data value in the middle, they've got to start all over again and read that whole thing again. So that's why you want to keep your data, your alt text, pretty short, right? Think tweet. It's that kind of size. So if we look at this example, pie chart, what is it? Showing 15 categories, what are my axes, of sales for 2020, right? That's the other axis. 80% of the sales came from cold calling. So what is the important information in the legend, and are there meaningful data values that I want to explain? So that is the formula that I use for creating meaningful alt text, right? It's not cut and dry. You are going to have to consult someone. You are going to have to use your brain and make those decisions on what information stays and what information goes, and maybe none of it goes, and you need to present it in a different way. I hope this shows you that you can include colorful and interesting infographics in your presentation. They don't all have to be black and white. It doesn't just have to be straight tables, but you have to think about how you're presenting that data. It just takes a little bit of getting used to and understanding, and maybe some compromise here and there. All right, guys, my name is Dax Castro. This has been Accessible Charts and Graphs. You can find me on Facebook or on YouTube with the keyword PDF accessibility. I run a Facebook group of about 400 people who are focused on document accessibility. All right, guys, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Hope you're enjoying Max,